You could never mention the Ferrari 250 GTO to him. $250 GTO. Need I say more? Probably the most expensive car that's ever sold at a public auction, and in recent years, the most expensive car that's ever traded hands, from my understanding. A car recently sold for just over 70 million. Another car hammered at RM Sotheby's, I think 48 million. So we're talking about the pinnacle of the automotive world in terms of value. You meet so many guys, whether it's Ferrari guys or just, you know, the average car enthusiast, that the first thing they always say is, isn't there a Ferrari or 50 million or 60? And they start throwing out these crazy numbers, and it's real. There's 33, maybe 32. There's some conflicts with a few. Ferrari 250 GTO, which is essentially considered the greatest Ferrari GT car. Incredible race history of some of the cars. So imagine 1967, 1968, my grandfather at his small service facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, had the opportunity to purchase a former racing 250 GTO, not just any 250 GTO, but a right-hand drive car, which is a little bit more rare, and the X-Surtees race car. A car with incredible history. You could say that today the car is arguably one of the best examples left. It was never in any major accidents, and he bought it for $6,800. So my grandfather at the time wasn't the most passionate car guy. He loved the car. He thought it was a cool car. And he was excited to share it with my father. Brought it home and took my dad for a ride. I think he maybe picked him up to school. And one of the great stories of while he had the car was they actually went to the Ford dealership. And the Ford dealership at the time was actually displaying, it was maybe a Saturday afternoon or something, where they had a big display for the new Ford GT40 that had just come back from Le Mans. And there was a crowd in the dealership around the car, and the second they pulled up in the 250 GTO, and my dad tells it best, the entire crowd came out to the parking lot to see the Ferrari. So my dad tells me all these great stories of how he didn't like the front grille. To him, it looked like chicken wire. And he used to take pliers and straighten out the grill. And he'd always told my grandfather that the car was crude. He didn't like it as much as a Lamborghini Miura, the Jaguar E-Types that my grandfather also bought and sold and had. So my grandfather, instead of keeping the car, decided to sell the car to Bob Sowers, Robert Sowers, who was actually a very well-known Ferrari collector looking back. He had some incredible cars that my grandfather worked on, actually Ferrari chassis 002, some other really great cars, 275 GTB4. And he did that actually to eventually buy, my dad wanted a Lamborghini Miura. He kept, Lamborghini Miura, I want a Miura. We got to get a Miura. So my grandfather sold the 250 GTO for, I think it was like $8,400 or $9,500. So he made a profit, which back then was probably pretty good. $3,000, something like that, and was extremely happy with this $3,000 profit in the late 60s. Fast forward, and you know, the 1980s comes, and the cars went up a little bit, but in the late 80s, Ferrari race cars and significant Ferraris started to explode. I mean, we're talking values went from 150,000, 200,000 to $1 million to $2 million. And I actually remember at one point in '94, I was at an auction, a cruise auction, where a 250 GTO hammered for around, I think it was $3 or $4 million. So imagine, that was a lot of money in the late 80s and a lot of money in the mid 90s. So my grandfather, who wasn't the biggest car guy or the most passionate car guy, you could never mention the Ferrari 250 GTO to him. You could never mention what the value was. You could never mention that he sold the car and made a $3,000 profit. So it's always been this funny story. Well, in recent times, with the advent of the internet and all these different things, I was actually able to trace down the exact car. So a couple of years ago at Cavallino, the Ferrari show in Palm Beach, we actually saw the exact car. And what's wild is the current owner today was actually the person that bought it in the 70s from Bob Sowers. So the car traded hands for probably a very small amount, and literally from my grandfather to Bob Sowers to this person. So we spoke to the guy that manages the car today. It was F40 Motorsports, Wayne Carini fame, and The car's lovingly used. It tracks around the country. It's enjoyed by the current owner, who has apparently no intentions to sell the car. But to see this now 60, 70, and maybe in the future more, 80, $90 million car in person that my grandfather once owned, that's probably the biggest mistake he's ever made. And in retrospect, maybe the biggest mistake my dad's ever made, not to convince him to keep the car. So I always love to tell people the story of shoulda, woulda, coulda. And if you bring up the car today to my dad, it further illustrates that my dad is just so passionate about Lamborghini Miuras, and specifically his Lamborghini Miura, that he doesn't really care. I mean, he thinks it's a cool story, but for him, the value isn't this number. It's the value is what he loves. So that always brings me back down to reality that, you know, collecting is not always about a number. It's not always about a car's worth 20 million. It's what the car speaks to you. What's interesting is people always ask me, why do I buy what I buy for inventory at our dealership Curated? And I buy what I love. And I tell that to collectors as well. Unfortunately, and maybe on the positive side for some individuals, cars have become a commodity. I mean, they've performed better than the stock market. They've performed better than gold in some cases. And they've become pure investments or you know, blue chip. I mean, people even use the term, I use the term, blue chip investments. And the reality is that for years, these were assets that were appreciated not for their value, but for their character, for the love that someone had for the brand, the mark, the designer, the engineering aspects. And it's funny because while I do have to understand market and while we do have to understand value with Curated, I always tell people, buy what you love. And that's what we do. I buy cars that excited me as a kid. To me, one of my favorite cars in the world is the Diablo SC30. It's what I had as a poster on my wall as a kid. I mean, I love that car. So the GTO specifically, and actually a lot of the cars that we chase today even, they would never be able to demand such insane premiums or these wild prices without at some point sort of disappearing off the radar and not being appreciated and not being valued. So I think that has to happen for the car to one day be worth $40, $50 million. And I think there's cars today even that, you know, I'm a huge fan of Jaguar XJ220s. People hated them. Nobody wanted them for a period of time. We don't have a crystal ball, but if you look historically, it's the cars that were always forgotten, unwanted, that ended up turning around and becoming the stuff of legend.
The story of your dream car starts with finding it, and the best way to do that is with Autotempest.com. Autotempest allows you to compare the results from Craigslist nationally with all the top listing sites. So visit Autotempest.com today, and before long, you'll be making some amazing car stories of your very own.